more and more, if I realize anything, is like it is a series of systematic marginal improvements that each and every one of us is constantly trying to make. And if we can all do, or more of us can do that on a continual basis, we have a shot at a better future.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome. Today's conversation is with Jack Wielebinski from One Small Planet. Jack is an experienced investor, and I really appreciate his authenticity and the lively energy he brings to the conversation. We discuss the unique fund structure of One Small Planet, why Jack believes that growing Indigenous leadership is so important in the finance space. I asked Jack about ESG, and he also discusses things like mental health and well-being. We touch a bit on carbon markets and really what are the barriers of growth around impact funds and impact investing overall. This conversation was recorded at Bioneers in March 2023. I hope you enjoy it. Jack Wielebinski. Today we're here with Jack Wielebinski. Welcome, Jack. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Third string invite, but no less a pleasure for me. And genuinely, I've always enjoyed riffing with you, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you as well. So take me through, what is One Small Planet?
So One Small Planet's focus and mission is to harmonize the wealth between people and planet. And when you look at the etymology of the word wealth, it wasn't about amassing huge sums of money. It was about well-being. And so it's really about trying to create, an equilibrium in well-being that is economic, but is also, environmental and cultural and all these different things that, actually contribute to the well-being of us as human beings, as well as the natural systems that we live in. And some of that is guided by economic systems. I mean, I think it's undeniable that that's a part of the world we live in today. So how to try to actually create, an equilibrium there.
Yeah, we've been playing with the same words about like converting from financial wealth into ecological wealth, or this like term rewilding resources.
Yep.
From resources that only refer to kind of financial commodity and how we've taken nature and turned it into resources.
Yep.
And then how do we kind of bring that back into a more ecological lens and a rewilding lens?
Yeah. I mean, deconstructing the idea of like, which a lot of capitalism, I mean, since the Industrial Revolution, at least, has been based on this idea of nature as a commodity, right? Timber is worth X dollars, oil is worth this, and it was just turning everything into dollar signs and commodifying it, which, as we were just in Ecuador together, I think the most beautiful examples of that are in Indigenous communities where it's a sacred relationship, and there's a huge spectrum of, I think, people trying to get back to that kind of a framework, but it's the Indigenous communities that I think have never really left and actually do live in a world where they don't even want to risk selling things like carbon credits because they're afraid that very commodification, even if it's non-extractive, is still part of the problem. And so that it's a huge question of our time. And it's no surprise that you guys are working on that. And I know some of the work you're doing, which is, super cool and inspiring on many levels.
Well, thanks for that. So fundamentally, One Small Planet is a fund. And I'm curious, like, so you're in the paradox of capitalism, and so how does it work? How's it constructed?
Yeah, great question. And so there's actually a couple different components of it. So I run, and we've set it up in, we have our 4 pillars, which are based off the 4 elements. We call what I do. I run along with Will Petterfier, our founder, the Fire Fund, which is, we like to call it Vital Capital, but for all intents and purposes, it's a venture capital fund. And that's looking at, venture type returns. But it's all focused on companies and projects that are, you know, generating economic returns as a business, but we're mission first. So it has to start from a place of, before we consider a business case or an investment, like, what is the problem being solved on an environmental basis? And I think there's some exciting, examples of that we can talk about more if we have the time. We have a separate philanthropic foundation that gives granting dollars predominantly to, nonprofits. Sometimes it's, we've sent stuff through a fiscal sponsor to like very boots on the ground Indigenous communities that are in, critical dire situations that we're trying to provide relief. And so I think the idea is kind of the water providing that release. The fire fund that I run is a bit more catalytic, maybe even aggressive if you want to say, but it's in a space where it's really trying to alchemize something in a different way as opposed to being more relief oriented. And then we have we've done some direct land deals. There's a regenerative farm in Kansas. There's a conservation project in the Osa Peninsula where I think you've been. We're looking at, a project this year that, maybe can talk about this time next year. But, kind of one-off stuff, but where we're trying to explore, what regeneration actually means.
And so that's the Earth Fund.
That's the Earth Fund, right? So direct land deals for the most part. And it's, kind of a more inactive, smaller, one-off, ad hoc. And then what we call AIR is kind of the marketing, the storytelling of what we try to do. And you were talking about our website, which I do think that there's a lot of thought put into the languaging, which is part of, how we tell the story does matter. And Yael, I know, is doing amazing work with that. A lot of people, are looking at, the spells we cast with the language we use. So that's a part of it too. And that's sort of the holistic frame of One Small Planet.
Got it. So there's water for kind of philanthropic relief. There's fire for more of that venture style investment returns. There's earth for direct land conservation deals, and then there's the air, which is kind of the narrative and the waters we swim in, or the air that we breathe. Yeah. I love it. Okay, so how did you get into this space? What led you to being the fund manager for the fire fund at One Small Planet?
Wow, I don't really know how to answer this question other than telling the truth.
It's a good place to start.
Yeah, no, it's a great place to start. I'd spent my entire career in institutional finance, private equity, iBanking. My last job, I'd helped take an online gambling SaaS company public. I got my MBA while I was working full time, and I'd spent a lot of my adult life. I had I personally struggled a lot growing up, and I wound up getting sober at a young age, and my very early 20s, and I was working with started doing some different ceremonial stuff with some different Indigenous communities that really took me in when they didn't have to, and taught me a lot. And so I was kind of I spent most of my free time doing that, and then I was kind of going back into these worlds that just felt diametrically opposed. And I was on kind of a bit of a sabbatical, and the sabbatical just kept going, and I just couldn't imagine the idea of going back to corporate life. But I had this skill set, and I was at a Sundance in Peru with an uncle of mine, a Lakota leader, and I met the team at One Small Planet. I mean, kismet, faith, fate, whatever you want to call it. And we just kind of started talking some about, all kinds of different things. And as we kept talking over the coming months, kind of realized that they needed some support, and I had a skill set that fit. And I mean, you can ask the rest of the team. I think it's worked out smashingly. They may have different opinions, but just kind of happened to be in the same place at the same time, and it all worked out. So yeah, that's how it happened. Story, I'm sticking to it.
Okay. I mean, it does seem, to my experience right now, that there are a lot of people looking for talent to help in climate finance. The intersection of these worlds is there's a lot happening here, and there's not necessarily
a lot of capacity that's fully built out of people who understand both worlds. Is that what you're seeing as well?
I mean, I'm reticent to say I understand both worlds.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that, um, I've been really lucky to spend time with different cultures around the world that have shared some of their life ways with me, and I think that's helped inform who I am as a human being. But like, if you want to know the truth, I think we need more um, Indigenous people running funds. And I was talking with you a little bit before. There's a group, and I should know the name exactly. Um, Raven Something Partners. It's an Indigenous-led fund. I mean, there are community development, finance institutions that are doing stuff on different reservations that I know about. And there's a very real thing with, I mean, we've been looking for an Indigenous board member for one of our port codes, and there's just fundamentally there's certainly not as many as I would like, because there's a real thing where white men have gotten more educated. White people have gotten more educated. Different cultures, because of systemic racism and economic barriers, have reaped a disproportionate benefit. And so there is a gap that needs to be filled. And like, I don't even want to sit here and say that I'm a bridge. Like, what I do think we need more people from Indigenous cultures of color, women. Like, we just need a more egalitarian society, and some of that does take time. There's a lag in how long it takes people to get an education or a career in institutional finance. And like, I was very lucky to have that, and I think what I can say is that I'm really happy that I've been given an opportunity to use that skill set in a way that I feel may actually be contributing to a better future. That's what I feel I can say confidently. Beyond that, I think it's maybe unfair commentary, in my opinion.
And can you share more about, so you've had these experiences with different cultures and different Indigenous traditions, probably more so than most people who come from the United States.
Sure, yeah.
And then you're also kind of speaking to this kind of, lack of necessarily capacity in some of these communities to participate in some of the institutional forms of our Western financial modern culture. Why is this so important? Like, what are you seeing here, and what kind of dots are you trying to connect, and what from your experience is giving you this emphasis?
These are huge systemic questions, right? And like, it is like, we need, and it's ironic as I say more people getting educated. Like, I know we have a shortage of like people that can swing a hammer and are going to trade schools in this country, right? Like, we probably need more of that too. But there's no, like, I don't think it's news to anyone that ultimately, like, I mean, certainly 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 90% of people in the corporate world were white men in the US, right? And like, we've made huge progress since then, but there's still a generational lag as we've seen more women get educated, or, people from South Asian cultures where they had, high levels of education. Like, Indigenous people, Black and brown people have not enjoyed the same benefit because of, certainly in the US, what I would call, systemic racism. And I mean, I think that's real. And I think we've made huge progress. And I think there's still tons more that needs to be made. And, I'm hopeful there is more. But yeah, I mean, I have like I guess what I'd call like a niece who's Dene. And I think she's the first person in her family to go to college. Like, my parents, my old man's an attorney, he had a master's degree, it's white, it's just more common. And what it is to be the first person in your family to go to college is a totally different thing. And so that's just part of the world we live in. And I know that there's lots of things moving to try to help improve that. And there's probably still more that needs to be done. And some of that takes time. It may take a generation. Does that make sense? Was that clear?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it speaks to kind of the importance of diversity in these different institutions. It speaks to the equity of recognizing that we wake up in a context where there has been a lot of oppression and colonization and disadvantage, and a different it's like one of my friends says, like, what, white people have had a 250 or 500-year head start on the current forms of finance and industrial civilization. And when you compound that head start, coupled with all of the trauma and oppression that happened before, like, to have a perspective now to say like, oh, well, now the system's, fair, so everyone's equal and the same. And it's like, well, actually, we need to reconcile the past, and we need to understand what healing looks like. And we need to understand the systemic issues that we currently still are reinforcing, with these different institutional forms. For me, it goes deeper as well, which was, to recognize that if we're trying to create a culture and a civilization that is in harmony with nature, it pays us to actually look at where are there cultures, and ideally intact cultures and peoples who have a more harmonious relationship with nature, and what can we learn, and how can we humble ourselves to the moment that we find ourselves in drawing these lessons from these different traditions. And I know you've done a lot of that work as well. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, I mean, and something, there was an essay I read recently, or an article, and it talked about like I want to say it was something like the colonial nature of conservation. But like what it really talked about, and this happens all the time in the way, for lack of a better term, Western frameworks work, but that like there's a centralized decision-making unit, person, authority that is usually the furthest away from the boots on the ground, decision. And so like in conservation, if you have someone in Washington, D.C. setting policy about what needs to go on in forest conservation in Northern California, like you should probably be talking to foresters, not a policy wonk in Washington, D.C., right? Because they just don't understand it. It's a theoretical framework. And so I think in the same way, like I think you said it really well, is like, it's, here we are at San Francisco and Pioneers, and look, I think Pioneers is an amazing organization, and they bring an amazing array of thinkers from around the world together. But like, the decisions need to be made in the places they're coming from. And like so often, and it's one of the things I think Pioneers does so well, is that like they bring Indigenous community leaders as well as scientists and business thinkers and artists together to try to exchange ideas. But like the ideas need to come from the places that are living in balance and harmony, right? Not a government based in another country or whatever it may be, right? And it's complex because at the same time, like we need world leaders to gather at places like the UN, and they're making decisions that affect everyone. And like sometimes they're making decisions about things that I don't know that they actually understand. And I'm not sure I have a full-blown solution on any given schematic on how we kind of demantle that kind of hierarchy. But I think we need more exchange with boots on the ground individuals and communities that are, like you said, actually living in harmony. And I think one of the facts that, everyone points to at a lot of these conferences is, look, 5% of global territory is controlled by Indigenous communities, or is custodian by Indigenous communities, as 80% of the biodiversity. So why are they not informing the conversation on biodiversity, right? And like, this is just kind of, basic thinking, right? I don't think that's rocket science.
Right.
I'm not a rocket scientist, but it makes sense to me,
No, okay. Yeah, so how do you express this work through One Small Planet?
That's a good question. I think one thing I'm so grateful for at One Small Planet, and I think some of the way we're set up is what enables that. And I'm really grateful for the culture. Is like, you and I were just on this trip to Ecuador, and like, if I worked at a regular VC fund, like I don't know that that's contributing to the bottom line. I don't know that we're ever going to do a business project there, but it was critical to informing understanding about sectors where we are invested. And I think informing my thinking and understanding as a human being of the implications of the actions I may take as one of the people who is fundamentally a decision-making authority in my ability to allocate capital. There's power in that. And so I think we need more education for people like me, for decision makers, to actually have the have the humility and take the time to go learn from other people who may know way more than me about topics that I'm making decisions with.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the things that I'm so grateful for that One Small Planet allows me to do.
Mm-hmm.
And, like I do allocate capital, right? We have a number of portfolio companies that are doing, different things. We've got some stuff in the carbon insetting and offsetting space, right? Nature-based services. We've done some alternative materials stuff. One of the really exciting companies I think we've invested in, not that I don't love all of our portfolio companies, but they, invented a styrofoam made from recycled trim shells. And like one of the things with,
which company is that?
It's called Cruise Foam. So they're based actually in Santa Cruz, California. And they, one of the things is like, look, plastics in certain ways are a really effective material, right? And I understand this is kind of polyurethane, which isn't exactly plastic, but it's in the same family, but like it's all made from petroleum waste.
Mm-hmm.
So not only are they effective materials, they're super cheap to make because their main input, they get paid to take it.
Mm-hmm.
So when this company, decided to use recycled shrimp shells, which is a food waste that they get shrimp, like literally,
wow.
like, and sometimes you get shelled shrimp at the grocery store, like all those shells go somewhere.
Right.
And there's a biopolymer called chitin that is one of the active ingredients in their, patented kind of formula that, basically has a lot of the same properties that a petrol waste would. And that has enabled them to actually compete at price parity because there's a lot of amazing alternative materials, but for mass scale, they're too expensive. A Pepsi, and I don't know that I should say anyone's name, but Pepsi, just as an example, like they use tons of plastic or styrofoam or whatever it may be. Like if they're paying 3x with the amount of units they ship, they can't pay 3x. That eats too much into the bottom line. So these guys, I think, really cracked a code to say, hey, we have a material you can use where you're not going to lose money. And in some cases, you're actually going to save money. So that's a win-win for, like people and planet. Like all of our ecosystems are better. And literally it's cheaper for us as consumers.
Right.
So, look, not every company is that exciting and is that clear cut, but that's an example that I think we're really excited about.
Yeah. What I love about this example is, and I've seen several in especially the waste to new value added, more ecologically minded packaging, so to speak. It is, I think it's a clear example where you can make a strong case for the merits of like this impact investing field, where there's efficiencies, there's we as tool making creatures come up with a more innovative way, mindful more now of our ecological and environmental impact than maybe previous generations in this paradigm were. And here we are, we find a way to reduce costs, increase the usage of materials throughout their life cycle, and that can capture economic value for the people who are producing those innovations. And so because there is still like, I feel like we're at this moment where we're still not really sure about the merits of like impact investment, like is it still just reinforcing the machines of capitalism? Can it produce a return, or is it actually the answer that we're moving into this more conscious forms of business? And how are you thinking about all of that?
I mean, look, first things first is it's such a broad term. Like we hear a lot of times I hear that people use the word regenerative. I'm like, what does that actually mean? Because there is a context for it. And then it's used as kind of like the same with sustainability, like sustainability in what context? Because it's just, and that's not a slam on anyone. It's just we use words that kind of we use them so much their meaning becomes a bit amorphous, right? So I think impact investing, look, in public market side, I think actually, God, I hope no one from Pepsi sees this, but like one of my understandings is like Pepsi has a really high ESG score, and like one of the reasons why was they eliminated 15% of plastic from the lids that they used, which meant that like, because they make so many bottles every year, like they eliminated like 10 million pounds of plastic, whatever it may be. But like, they're still probably one of the largest plastics users on the planet. So like, how good is that? And oil companies are similar. Like they get great ESG scores because they have super organized governance, but like dude,
Yeah.
you're still out here, doing oil spills in the Gulf Coast. Like,
Right.
are you really a good company? I don't
Right.
know.
Right.
So like, there's this huge spectrum of like, you can look at a cruise foam, which I think a lot of my rabid capitalist friends would be like, this is amazing. Like and in fact, there's another company that we're invested in. And I probably should be careful in saying who the co-investors were, but we just recently invested in a company in the fashion sector. So it turns out the second largest water contaminator on the planet is textile dyeing.
Right.
Like to just dye your shirt, it's like
Right.
thousands of gallons to dye like a few yards of fabric. It's super water intensive. This company invented a machine that eliminates 95% of water waste. It has 5x the throughput. So it's cheaper to run. It pays for itself in 18 months because you save so much on OpEx. And actually a major fast fashion brand invested in it, not because they cared at all about sustainability. It was cheaper to their supply chain. So like, it's another one of those cases where like, it just makes business sense, and we can have it make business sense and not make a bigger mess. And what I actually think we need is more innovation and thinking along those lines. Like how can we have both? How can it be, there's some author out there who talks about the genius of the and versus the tyranny of the or. If you're sitting there telling yourself, well, we can either save money or we can be more efficient, like what if you can do both? And there are situations where that's out there. And so, you have, I think, those examples where it's tough for a rabid capitalist to disagree with it. And then you have examples where it's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's greenwashing, and it can all be impact investing. So I think we have to really be specific in what we're talking about, because, these words they become very buzzy and catchphrasy. And look, you can talk about finance and it's like, it's a huge topic. Public markets, private markets, emerging markets, we just doing bookkeeping, or we doing, exotic derivative spreads. Like it's a huge universe in there. So I think the granularity is helpful sometimes.
Yeah. And I think where I have this like concern is when we say, oh, we're being optimistic. We're looking for both and solutions that it can all coexist. We're going to, but the carrying capacity of the planet relative to our current consumption and lifestyles, like necessitates a conversation about the very precepts of growth and, limits. Right.
Yeah.
And like, so I absolutely want, the used shrimp shells to go to better function and remove the styrofoam. And I'm like, yes, like, please, let's get rid of the styrofoam, replace it with mushrooms and use shrimp shells, whatever. And like, are we fooling ourselves to think that we're going to iteratively innovate ourselves from the mess that we've created?
Yeah, there's we're actually limited partners in a fund, and I've had some of this conversation about, like how much consumer behavior needs to change. And the fund manager, obviously, he doesn't really believe that consumers change behavior very readily. And like, and I think some of that, you see the documentaries on Netflix, like there was the one, the minimalism is a big thing, and like it kind of becomes in vogue. And like, I don't know that I have those answers. I don't know that I'm smart enough or well educated enough on what the full-blown consumption is on the planet versus like the full amount of resources and what that looks like. I mean, my gut instinct is though, like, I talk about this a lot. Mental health is something that's certainly something I'm interested in and care about. And as someone who spends a lot of time in other countries and other cultures, look, I don't think it's a coincidence that we're one of the most, quote unquote, developed societies, and like depression rates are at all-time highs, addiction rates are massive. We have opioid epidemics, and like discontentedness is super high. And I think some of that's fueled by a world where you can get anything you want delivered to your door on Amazon in 24 hours, and you get it and it doesn't fix anything, and you just keep ordering more and more and more, and the boxes pile up in the styrofoam. And it's like, there's actually, if there's anything I've learned spending time in other cultures and countries, is like, there's something so rich in not having what you want all the time and actually appreciating what you have. And that, like, and unfortunately, we are sold the opposite of that by every major corporation and every major, form of media we consume all the time.
Right.
And there's an undoing in that. I mean,
Right.
because it doesn't seem to be helping anything,
Right.
and I think that shows, I mean, you live in New Zealand, you maybe don't see it to the same degree, but like, I mean, I feel like I see it. I see people that are, really struggling to find a sense of direction, peace, purpose.
Mm-hmm.
They have everything they want and more.
Mm-hmm.
And half the time they're figuring out how to get rid of it, and I go through that sometimes, it's like, I feel like it's part and parcel of the culture we live in.
Mm-hmm.
So some of these questions are way beyond the scope of what I
Totally.
can answer. And I hope I'm not rambling, but
No, it's super helpful. And I want to go back to our little, rant on Pepsi. And fortunately, I don't expect them to watch this. But yeah, with all due respect to the people of Pepsi, let's talk about the institution. I mean, it's an example of, like you said, like from an absolute perspective, there's a tremendous amount of plastic waste. And, let's not even go in terms of like what water bottling has done on this planet in the last decade.
Yeah.
But yet here you get the good ESG scores because of a relative improvement.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. And I want to make the link to the additionality conversation that I know, we both had in Ecuador around carbon.
Yep.
Because you have this weird incentive structure right now in carbon markets, which is start with something that's been deforested and a blank slate, plant a bunch of trees so that we can really be confident that it wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Yep.
That's the additionality so that we can then pay you the carbon credits. And meanwhile, you have communities, often indigenous communities, who have been stewarding the most biodiverse, rich ecosystems on the planet, not cutting the trees down. But sorry, you don't qualify for carbon credits because we can't prove additionality.
Yeah.
So what is it about this financial logic of the relative versus the absolute, and where are we redistributing resources to with these new financial incentives for well-intentioned environmental purposes?
And that's like, and I think some of this comes down to like, there needs to be nuance, because like, I think that if someone is going into where there's been a burn, and you can debate that because it's going to burn down again, but these are all, like for all intents and purposes, if you're going and you're planting trees and helping reforest, that's great. We can prove additionality. There's labor that goes into that. There should be a remuneration for that. And there's communities that like, I mean, if I understand this as some kind of a tax on corporations who should not be, who have created environmental harm that the commons of planet Earth has paid the price for, and they distributed money back to shareholders without remunerating everyone for that harm. And carbon is an idea of how to at least get them to remunerate some of these communities around the world for this kind of custodianship without development. Okay, cool. That's interesting, right? And like we've invested some in that space, but like, again, there needs to be a consideration for, like you said, the communities that have never cut it down or developed their territories, oftentimes fighting with their lives to protect it from mining, oil extraction, logging, whatever it may be. And that because it doesn't fit this, same thing with some Western schematic, or, maybe it came out, but it wasn't coming from conservation territories, I don't think. I know. There needs to be new ways of thinking about that. We need to open up our minds and our dialogues to be broader, right? Because it's the same thing with impact investing. And all of a sudden a Cruise Foam and a Pepsi are in the same bucket. And I don't think those are the same companies.
Right.
And not because I don't think Pepsi shouldn't be trying to do things like reduce 15% of the plastic in bottle caps.
Yeah.
And that does deserve, some kind of appreciation, but those are fundamentally different things. And so I think someone doing a reforesting project in Canada or California or Oregon is completely different and should be considered completely differently than standing forest in the Peruvian Amazon.
Right.
And we need to be able to, I think, dive in on some of that nuance, and I think not be as academically lazy trying to just throw catch-all phrases around.
And so for someone that's not as entrenched in the world of finance, but hears this buzz term ESG and, a lot of narratives on both sides of that, but how real is it, of like, how much is it benefit Pepsi when they do that 15% reduction and then they get the good ESG scores, just as a matter of example, because is there money now flowing where people are like, oh, great, I'm being environmentally and socially conscious, pat myself on the back, I'm going to get into these ESG funds, and then it's just actually reinforcing from an absolute basis, highly destructive, my words, not yours, behavior.
I think that absolutely exists to one degree or another. And again, I don't think that anyone, investing in ESG funds is necessarily patting themselves on the back. And I think there's lots of public market allocations that are being more creative than saying, well, let's just throw it in Pepsi and Shell because they have high ESG scores. I mean, something I'll say that I meet people and sometimes I tell them what they do for work. They're like, oh my God, so cool. Like you're out there saving the world. And first off, I'm not doing anything to save the world. Like it is, and more and more, if I realize anything, is it is a series of systematic marginal improvements that each and every one of us is constantly trying to make. And if we can all do, or more of us can do that on a continual basis, we have a shot at a better future. And and actually Yael and I have talked about when she said what, some of the storytelling changes they make, I'm a huge believer. Anyone that says they're saving the world, I'm just reticent of. If the world's been taking care of us the whole time and us thinking we're doing anything to save it, we're the ones that have been creating harm. And I know that I'm constantly questioning the good we are or are not doing.
Yeah.
And there are examples where I think we can be really proud of what we're doing. And there's plenty of places where I'm trying to figure out solutions and how we can do better, how whole systems can do better. And I think that the vigilance there for all of us to continually be trying to move this forward, because I feel like there's to rest on our laurels of, hey, I did some ESG investing, I'm good. I think there's constantly more. And it even in the way we show up in our lives, it's a lot of it's local. Where are we buying food? Where are we growing? How are we growing food? What, all these things. How are we showing up to actually monitor each other's mental health and be there for each other? I think all these things make a difference. And again, I think that's constant, constantly trying to learn how we can show up better as I want to say human beings, but as members of this earth, that we are a part of nature, and a lot of the things we've done have destroyed it, we're not the ones saving nature. If anything, it's saving us. And we need to try to do a better job remembering and aligning to that.
Yeah, well said. And you referenced Yael Morantz, who runs Culture Hack Labs. We'll put a link in the show notes, doing really interesting narrative intervention work. So you also said that mental health and well-being is a passion. I'd love to hear more about that and how you're thinking about that space.
Yeah, I mean, I was, growing up, it's kind of interesting to talk about, but it sounds like it's not the world's. It sounds like Pepsi's not going to see it, so hopefully it's not distributed too widely.
Audience of
all
10,
of a sudden,
10
this
people,
is
which is just our family
world, right?
watching this. Yeah.
But I growing up, I was at first it was really depressed and bipolar and drug addict and all these different things, and there was just, I grew up in Texas at a time where no one talked about it, and I grew up in a family, you kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of thing, sweep it under the rug. And it's not a judgment on my family, it's the same thing. We all grew up with what we grew up with, no one knew how to deal with that. And, I think it was actually, I got sober in AA when I was young, and I started spending time in Indigenous communities. And it was that no one there told me that I was sick and I needed to take pills or my life was going to be a mess, and maybe that's not what doctors said to me, but that was how I heard it. And you've traveled in groups. I can be a little rambunctious, kind of hyperactive. I got they were doing another podcast before this, hey, you guys are being really loud. We can hear you out front of the house. And I got kicked out of class a lot as a kid. I was just, I guess hypomanic, ADHD, whatever you wanted to call it. And as an adult, look, I'm a big personality. I got a lot of energy. I came from Ecuador right here. I'm flying out tonight. The way I live my life is probably a little crazy making a lot of people. And that's just how I am.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think actually being encouraged for what I felt was the first time in my life to be who I was instead of being told it was wrong, changed my life. Like I personally feel that way, that it was like, who you are is okay. No one had ever said that to me because I grew up in a world that was super competitive and private schools and this and that, and be fit in the box to be whatever the world wanted you to be.
Right.
And I just didn't jive with that.
Right.
And I spent a lot of time in do a lot of stuff with men because I feel like men's group stuff, because I feel like men don't get to talk about these things in our society. And I was actually having a talk with a woman about that. She's like, oh, men don't deal with this stuff. It's like, men absolutely deal with this stuff, and we can't even talk about it. It's so bad you think we don't even have it. And like, we have all kinds of issues and I think a lot of that has contributed to things like domestic violence, machismo, all these different things. And so I think we actually have a crisis with men in a lot of ways, and at least the societies that I live and walk in. And so, and it's all over, right? I mean, there's tons of different stuff I do, but I think that, there's this frame of like well-being and being, what it actually is to be a human being instead of even just a product, because I certainly see and feel sometimes like I meet people that like and I've been guilty of this in my life. They've checked off every box and they've done all these amazing things, and they're like, I feel totally empty in my life. And they make tons of money and they live in a nice house and they got a nice car and they seem lost. And I think that just gets back to like, this understanding of like, who am I in a bigger context and what am I doing on this planet beyond just working and buying a nice house and a nice car to live in some neighborhood and say that I sent my kids to a certain college.
Right.
And I see a lot of that. And maybe I'm a judgmental jerk. It wouldn't be the first time I've been told that, but I see the world differently. And that's made a difference in my life, whether or not that's right or wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it does seem like the stories of the past generations or, the American dream are deteriorating before our eyes. And it is, such an interesting juxtaposition that in our efforts to address depression and mental health crises that we keep kind of atomizing the problem into some new ailment and, come up with some new pill, which happens to sit nicely on top of the financial incentive construct, rather than accept and include and welcome in the diversity of the human experience and with compassion for, I see it also in myself as well, where there's like judgment against the younger generation at times. But then I think about like how hard it must be to grow up right now. Like, I mean, we can look at COVID, for example, from our perspective, but like, you think about the students in schools or the young children or the, losing your first years of college and like these formative experiences of being alive on this planet right now, being shaped by what's happening and at this seemingly accelerating pace of crisis and, the collective doom that impends in so much of our media and narrative. I'm curious if you have any other observations or kind of insights into what you think would be medicine and healing for our collective, kind of mental health at this time.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you said is the compassion and like the compassion I didn't have for myself. And like, I mean, I joke about it with my friend because sometimes I see, I mean, I don't think it's news to anyone that there's, a lot of ceremony that goes on and Westerners come in and go and do these things. And sometimes I see things that really are offensive to me, You
mean about visiting indigenous cultures? And
visiting where, I mean, like, look, there's people that travel to the West and kind of ceremony goes on and there's organizations that do it and organize it now. There's been, I mean, at least in the roads I walk, there seems to be a proliferation of it. And like,
and by ceremony, you mean plant medicines
I mean, it's all kinds of different stuff, but that's certainly, I think, one of the more common and popular, and we could talk all about that. And like, I look at the people who took me in and just taught me things and taught me how to grow up and how to be, a man when I was a lost kid, and just said, hey, keep doing this. You're going to find something good in your life. And like, and I try to have the same approach, even though sometimes I get a little angry. And like, outside of that context, I think that ultimately, like, what you said was beautiful. Like, we all need to have COVID was hard for everyone. I mean, my old man talked to me about feeling depressed for his first time in his life. He's like, I think I know what that is now.
Wow.
It was hard for everybody. And like, I mean, I've called other fund managers and been like, can we talk about like if, like as I look at some of the data and stuff and like, yeah, I feel like in certain ways we're making progress. And I look at some of the rest of them, like, this is not good.
Right.
I'm like, are we like, should I just kill myself now or move to an island? Like, how much time do we have? Like, kind of having a panic attack. And like, we need to help and be there. And actually something we talk about, something is like, yeah, the day I'm having a breakdown, the people around me aren't. Like, thank God we don't all have a breakdown the same day. We're all human beings.
Right.
It all gets tough. Like, maybe we can understand and appreciate that. And like, dude, someone needs to take a mental health day because they're burned out in our organization. Cool. Take a rest. I trust the people I work with enough to like, we all work more than 40 hours a week. We don't need to be sitting there counting hours. Like, we're human beings. Let's appreciate that. And it gets back to like the natural flow of systems. Like, in terms of like biomimicry, like, when is anything doing anything for exactly 40 hours a week at the exact same time? There's gyrations and ebbs and flows. And like, we all need to, I think, just try to be more in harmony with the ebbs and flows of life. And sometimes you are more depressed. Things are hard. People die. Life gets hard sometimes.
Right.
And sometimes it's amazing, and we're all just ecstatically swinging from the rafters. At least I am.
Nice.
And that's life.
So I don't know any elegant way to pivot us, but I do want to go back into some of the nuts and bolts of finance.
Great.
Because you do have a unique lens and set of experiences here.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people are going to be eager to hear. So what other trends are you seeing kind of in this space at these kind of, let's call it, climate and finance intersections? And I also would love to touch on kind of, I know that you're thinking about the blended approach of things like your water fund, your philanthropic fund, and your fire fund and venture, and like how is that fitting together?
Yeah, I'll start with the water and fire fund, and there's other organizations that are set up like this. I was talking about co-investment with a group this morning, and they actually do a lot more philanthropic and have added on kind of an investment, small investment vehicle. And there's other groups that I know that are writing way bigger checks than we are, both philanthropically and capital deployment wise, that, we're looking at some projects that we're maybe upscaling into their ecosystem. And I think that there's a lot to be potentially gained in that model, because like, I mean, at the same time too, like I would love to see more communities where and not everything needs to move this direction, but where more communities had their own economic sovereignty, so they didn't need to go and philanthropically ask someone else to approve their ways of living or projects because they were able to generate that themselves. I think that's a part of sustainability, right? Is that you can take care and sustain, yourself in that way. And again, there's totally need for, I'm not against philanthropy at all, like, but there is something to be said when you can generate that yourself and you don't even need outside investment capital because you're kicking off profits, right? One of the things that I think is really cool is in certain deals, our water fund is actually invested alongside of us. And so if those investments are successful, the returns they generate will go back into the granting dollars, which I just think is such a cool structure, that we have that. And I think puts more of an onus on us to really make sure that those investments where they participate are doing well, because again, that's part of the dollars we can give away. Overall in the impact investing space, and I'll first talk about, sometimes I feel like I'm a bit of a pessimist or what I like to call a realist, but like what I think is so exciting is, look, at the end of the day, I'm a finance nerd. Like I remember reading white papers about like from JPM and stuff about impact investing when it was a nascent asset class behind a pay. Like it was a wonk, it was a wonk nerd econ paper. I'm like, this is the coolest thing ever. I want to do this someday. And and like 10 years later, watching the evolution of that space, there's tons of funds coming up. There's tons of talented entrepreneurs coming up with really cool ideas. Like there's more of an, there's more capital and there's more places to put that capital. And that's what we need. We need innovation being funded so we can come up with, ideas like cruise foam that maybe can help make the world a better place. And so I do think there's really an awesome growing ecosystem of founders, entrepreneurs, talent. I can't tell you how many people I've met here in the Bay Area in the last 48 hours that are like, yeah, I went out of venture, I went out of corporate this, like I'm working at a nonprofit, I'm working at a startup, I'm trying to solve these problems. And like, I think that's part of our generation right now.
Yeah.
And it's awesome. I mean, like totally, genuinely, it is awesome to see people doing that. And one of the things that like, I do think is also from a macro perspective important to look at is as much as impact has grown explosively, it's still a rounding error. For the trillions of regular investment dollars, the billions, tens of billions in impact, are still not enough. And you see these major, I guess I'm going to call out Bill Gates, called out Pepsi, may as well, it's like, and maybe he's not even the best example. Maybe he is really giving precipitous amounts, but like, I think a lot of times you see people that are, or funds that are saying, oh yeah, we have 10 funds that are $1 billion and our 11th fund, which is 50 million, is in impact. Right. So it's like, okay, yes, that's awesome. And it's kind of the Pepsi example. It's like, okay, you did something, but like, it's different when it's, I think, baked into the DNA or we're seeing, I'd love to see impact funds cannibalizing regular funds because the returns are better. I don't know that we're there yet.
Right.
But, I do think we need to, stay in context of like, yeah, look, there's still billions of dollars going to fossil fuels every year. Like there's still huge amounts of capital that have no interest in this. And we're moving in the right direction. Like impact is not shrinking. It's growing by leaps and bounds. But I think we have a long way to grow, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is it's almost like this next generation's task is kind of, or the narrative is less about the fancy car and the house and the college you went to, and more about the impact that we're having in the world, and recognizing that like we want our work to have purpose and we want our work to contribute to the collective meaning. No, not convinced.
No, I was actually thinking, I was like, for how much of a cynic and a misanthrope I can be, that sounds like a maybe not far off reality that we're moving into.
I mean, certainly like the conversations we've had with pioneers, everyone's like, it's table stakes to be like doing work that's good for the planet. Otherwise, what are you doing?
Yeah. Right? And I think there's more, like, look, I could be doing something else, making a lot more money. I just don't I don't, you know what I mean? I don't need a second car, a bigger this or whatever. Like, it just doesn't interest me that much, and I think there's more and more people saying that. It's like, you don't need to make $1 million a year or whatever it is. Like, you can make a good living doing something that you really care about. And I've found in my life that when I'm interested in and care about something, I tend to be myself.
Yeah.
I'm way more successful at it.
Totally. And happier.
Yeah. Which is important, getting back to the mental health thing.
Yeah.
Like, for sure.
And then you also made the observation that like, even despite good strides that's been made in impact investing as a broad, loose term that can mean a lot of different things, it's still a rounding error relative to kind of the total capital that's sloshing around the planet and where that capital is being directed. And I'm curious, like, what are the barriers to growth? And with one observation from my side, which is when we have an endowment and we try to deploy that endowment into investments that we feel good about, as at the very least preservation of capital until we give it out in gifts to nonprofits that we support.
Right.
But it's actually really hard to find liquid impact instruments, and what I mean by that is a lot of the impact investment funds require you to basically go lock that capital up for 7, 10, 12 undefined periods of time. And that's kind of hard to get behind because you're like, well, I don't know if we're going to need the capital. And like, we exist as a philanthropic organization that wants to give it away. So locking it up for 10 years, who can figure out what's going to happen in 10 years on this planet right now? So then you're like, okay, back to government bonds, like back to indexes of publicly traded companies. Like, well, that's not super inspiring either. So yeah, that barrier and or other barriers to growth, like what are you seeing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a couple groups that I have to be frank, I haven't, and I don't know their names off the top of my head, that I think are doing some public markets allocations. And like there's some out there,
Yeah.
and like I don't even know if maybe they're all micro caps and small caps. You run into some of at least quasi the same liquidity issues.
Right.
But I think the point that you're pointing to in a macro way is some of what we were talking about with like if we wanted to see more indigenous board members, there's, like it may take a generation to increase education and work experience to create that ecosystem. And like something that I've actually kind of been looking at, thinking about, and maybe it's unbridled optimism, but BlackRock has said what they're going to put, I think, trillions or hundreds of billions into ESG capital. Like some of the reason I don't think they can do that today is there's not places to put that money. I mean, I think what's being built now in the venture impact ecosystem is hopefully trying to scale up enough of these companies to be able to take $100 million check. I don't know that anything in our portfolio could take a $10 to $50 million check right now.
Yeah.
And so it's actually having to build, the ecosystem and infrastructure towards a less detrimental economy that then can take that kind of major institutional, because like, sure, we're institutional, but in the grand scheme of things, like not really, institutionals,
Yep.
100 million into IPO, right? So I think that like those companies don't exist yet. I think it's what we're trying to do right now to move that up into the next level of what could be some kind of impact PE. There's actually I spoke on a panel, I think about a year ago with a really interesting guy who has developed, and this actually may answer some of your questions on the public market side, was a new exchange that all the companies on it had to be kind of approved through this framework of like green, and that they had to be, doing demonstrable things to not just be ESG, to really benefit an environmental aspect. And, I think things like that are interesting. I think we need to see more companies doing that and more frames to help support that, because some of it may be, you guys may be really interested. And I know it's something we've talked about on the foundation side is, deeper level of not only, I think, divestiture, but actually deploying into companies that on the portfolio side we believe in from a public markets basis, because you also have, liquidity needs, right? You can't just be in, some locked up 10-year, illiquid investment.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I mean, the challenge I have with it is I like this general skepticism and distrust of like, okay, well, if I go into those publicly traded ESG funds, then I'm just like going into Pepsi, right? And which gets us back full circle to the challenge that we talked about. But it is also just interesting. I mean, I'm interviewing folks who are consistently in the environmental space, seeing the scarcity of capital towards the solutions we need. And so it's also fascinating to then hear from an investment perspective, I completely resonate with as well. Like the big money, like there's actually not the water catchments to go put the big dollars to work. And we have a lot of capacity and bridges and things to build on both sides of this.
And that's so, and I think this gets back to like, we need to be nuanced in our understanding of the systems. And sometimes I do feel like there's people who don't understand financial systems talking about things. And it's like, and the same way it can take a generation to reforest a forest, increase education in a community, it may take us a generation to build the right level of companies and systems and infrastructure to actually be able to switch that kind of capital allocation in. And that's life, and like getting into biomimicry and all that, like it takes a fully grown oak 40 years to grow. Like, some things do take time. And I do think that, like you said, I do think there's really positive strides being made in impact, and there's so long to go. And I may not get to see a lot of that happen in my lifetime. Maybe I do.
Right.
But what you're talking about is real. I completely resonate with that.
Interesting. And what about the carbon markets? I mean, like, can we talk a bit about what's going on here with ecological credits, carbon credits, biodiversity credits, water catchment? Like, what are you seeing there, and how would you frame your vantage point on the landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, Vera's been under a lot of heat lately, and like I think some of that is good. Like I'm not even in a way where I'm like, I don't want to demonize Vera or Pepsi or anyone, but
And
like,
Vera, for those who may not be as
yeah,
familiar, is kind of the leading accreditation standard for carbon credits.
yep. And so, there's been this kind of debate on the efficacy of their standards in terms of how I think up to 95% of their credits may not have contributed anything,
Right.
to decarbonization.
Right. There was a
Um,
Guardian
th-
Journal article
yeah,
earlier
there's been
this
a
year.
series of them,
Yeah.
and and on the one hand, like, yeah, I mean, so look, that's gone on, and what I do think is hopefully outside of Vera, I mean, yeah, great. I hope Vera comes up with better standards, but like we were talking about, is I think there needs to be a series of better standards written in ways that are including more diverse frameworks of stakeholders in the system.
Mm.
Whether that's indigenous communities or standing forest beyond simply, reforestation. And again, I think there's ways to price this in the market. And of course, like, look, part of the situation of human nature is like, from an investment manager perspective, look, like no one gets fired for putting money with BlackRock or Bain Capital, a brand name, right?
Mm.
Because even if it goes wrong, well, everyone did that.
Mm.
If you go and you do some different credit or something that's not approved, like, and it goes wrong, then you're really in trouble, right? Like we've all seen the bad press with different, companies and organizations buying credits from Vera. And it's like, well, it was the standard. We all did it. Like, yeah, we made a mistake, but who hasn't at this point? And so, I think moving away from that and try to actually get a higher level of education in carbon markets with institutional buyers, developers, registry systems, whatever that may be, I think there's a huge evolution that needs to go on there. I think a lot of people are, a lot of people talk about biodiversity because, and I don't think this is rocket science or news to anyone, but like, carbon is just not, it's a part of it, right? It's no ecosystem runs on just carbon. It's
Right.
water and trees and all this holistic, right? And I think we're so quick to just pick one thing and,
Right.
let's just go myopic on that. And that creates all these secondary effects that create so many of the problems in our society, right? So, I think biodiversity is a part of that. I know a lot of different people that are, in portcos and this and that are all contributing to stuff. I don't know of any real standard or schematic there yet. I hear a lot of stuff about water. I mean, I care deeply about water. I think water is one of the most, I mean, water is life. And beyond that, like it's, you hear sometimes scary people talking about water as one of the most critical commodities on the planet. And like, that's scary, right? But how can we actually, conserve and custodian and protect water in a more holistic way, I think is a critical part of the equation. And I think what we all need to be aware of is how to not, I mean, looking at what just happened with Vera, how to not go in and create bad standards again that create more problems.
Right.
How do we actually sit down and think about how to correctly incentivize preservation and custodianship of these critical aspects of life like biodiversity and water in a way that we can allocate money towards that? Because like in its essence, I think carbon credits are about how can we allocate money from people who create environmental harm into forests and communities that custodian them. And I think that the way that that was set up led to some bad acting, and like even before, the generation of companies we're investing in, and you still see them out there. I mean, there's carbon cowboys doing things that are egregious and, arguably no better than what, wildcatters were doing in oil. And like, yes, there's always going to be bad actors, but how do we set up a system to avoid that?
Right.
And like, I don't want to see biodiversity or water credits that are incentivizing bad action. Like we need to really think about these things before we just jump into it. And there's that constant matching of, yes, things are dire and we need to move quickly. And we need to be really careful and cautious. Like that balancing act of, yes, we need to act, and like, but how do we move in the right way that's thoughtful and engaging of the right stakeholders in a way that's not going to create more harm? That critical dance is like something I'm looking at constantly.
Yeah.
Because I mean, it's really easy to be, oh my God, the world's dying. Like we got to go write checks, do this.
Yeah.
And we need to do things in a way that we don't create another set of problems that we're going to be cleaning up another year or 2 or 5 or 50 from now.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing I would add from my perspective is like, I took a flight here, burned some fossil fuels to do that. We have a tractor on the farm. There's not like great renewable energy options for tractors. And, we're doing our best to live within the paradox that there's trade-offs and energy consumption and use and the use of fossil fuels. And so, how do we just take full responsibility for our impact and say, okay, well, can I recognize that full cost accounting of my impact on the commons, because I'm contributing to parts per million out in our collective atmosphere, and value that not with the $2 Air New Zealand checkbox. It's like this illusion that somehow $2 is going to reconcile my impact on the planet for flying across the world. But at least it's a start. And if we can channel those funds into conservation and reforestation and cleanup and all of these other activities, like it seems like we should be able to design a global economy that it's not just about big corporations paying for their footprint. It's about all of us taking responsibility for the holistic impact we're having.
Yeah. And I think that's, I'm huge on personal responsibility. And some of that I think comes down to the systems too, of like, okay, well, with what Air New Zealand is doing, like where are those credits coming from? Where are those dollars going to? So there is this like trust that we have to have. And I think some of that gets back to the systems. And I think too is like, and it's really good for me to say this to myself, because, sometimes it is really hard to feel like you're making it. You're looking at these massive problems and it's like, are we doing anything? Are we getting anywhere? And it's like, it's a step at a time. It is iterative, and small wins can make a difference, and it's never going to be perfect. And like, and there's other funds and other groups and other organizations. There's so many people trying to do things. And like, so can we all just do enough to make it a little bit better? And that there's actually this other fund manager, we're an LP in his fund, and he's a physicist. I mean, like patents out the yin yang, and brilliant, and did all this stuff, and a Google guy, and he's just way smarter than I'll ever be, And I was talking to him one day about like some of, it's like, like, are we making a difference? What's going to happen? And I think he was trying to make me feel better. And I'm not sure that he actually did, but he's like, look, I'm a physicist. So I look at really long timelines. He's like, we're in the 6th mass extinction event. And, the question is, how bad is it going to be? He's like, are we going to lose 90% of species, or are we going to lose 10%? And like literally the actions we're taking right now are going to determine that as a species, and really not as a species, as the whole global planet. Our actions are determining that for the whole planet. And like, I guess what I try to be optimistic of is that if more and more of us can continue to take these actions, and more money lines up, and more working together between diverse stakeholders to properly contribute to the voices that need to be contributing to standards and ideas and justice and preservation and conservation, all comes together, and we can all keep doing better, that maybe it's only 10%. Like, and I have to tell myself that, because if I start thinking 90, I'm like, dude, I'm just going to go live on an island and, drown myself. It's really easy to get into doom and gloom. I don't mean to be that way, but like, I have to believe that, like, and actually it's not a belief. Like, we have autonomy. Our actions make a difference. We got ourselves here. And if we can do enough systematically together for long enough, I believe we can mitigate that crisis,
Awesome. Well, I think that's a perfect place to leave it on a relatively hopeful note. Thank you, Jack, for being with us. Really appreciate your time and the conversation.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It was a pleasure.
Awesome.
Thanks for watching. To learn more, you can go to onesmallplanet.org. There's a link in the show notes. Please like, share, subscribe, join our community Discord, and find all of our conversations at maearth.com. We'll see you on the next one.